tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The task is mighty, and so are we. The task is mighty, and so are we. The task is mighty, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The land is holy, and so are we. The land is holy, and so are we. The land is holy, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The storm is raging, and so are we. The storm is raging, and so are we. The storm is raging, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The sun is shining, and so are we. The sun is shining, and so are we. The sun is shining, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The world is ready, and so are we. The world is ready, and so are we. The world is ready, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. The tide is rising, and so are we. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called to be. This is where we are called.
I would like to invite you to this very special service, our UN Sunday. I want to welcome you from the comfort of your homes. Welcome you. I hope you find yourselves in comfortable positions as you join us virtually, knowing that this way that we gather is so important and keeps us connected. I'm joining you from my apartment here in Marble Hill, Manhattan, grateful to be championing the Unitarian Church of Staten Island. And this special service this morning is the UN Sunday, All In for Climate Justice. And we are very, very grateful to have joining us the Executive Director of the UU-UNO office, Bruce Knott. He has served with the UU-UNO for years and years. He has championed us with the United Nations office, championed Unitarian Universalist values across the world. And we are grateful to be a congregation that has partnered with the United Nations office all of these years. Special thanks to our envoy, Sarah Dolinar, who will be our Worship Guild Associate today as we lift up this special service about climate justice and how important it is. I now hand it over to Sarah Dolinar for our opening words.
Good morning, everyone. Our opening words are When We Pause to Remember by Alicia Ford. When we pause to remember who we are, companions on this great experiment called life. When we take a moment to shed the ways we have been carefully taught, to lead from fear, to punish the poor, to persecute those who don't look like we do, to deny rights to those who love, to believe that we are separate, that some people are superior to others. When we take a moment to shed all of that and hear our stories, hear and see each other into existence, into community, when we take a moment to embrace, to practice a different way of being, when we answer the call of love, then we're living into the promise of building the world we dream about. It is beautiful to dream, to cast a vision, to stretch our minds into the future and imagine what we may be if we were to build a new way of being, not someday, but beginning again today. Beginning again every day that we have breath, taking courage with these hands and hearts to make real the dream of a more equitable world, to journey together, seeking to be transformed, even as we transform, becoming explorers and learned in this world around us, humbled by what we do not yet know. Fulfilling the promise of healing a fragmented world, laboring not just in hope, but also in love. In this spirit we commit, in this spirit we gather, in this spirit we pray.
Thank you for those beautiful words. And I now once again invite Sarah to lead our chalice lighting this morning.
Today's chalice lighting is called In Faith by Sunshine Jeremiah Wolf. This is a congregation that gathers in faith, not faith in one religion or in one God or in any one way. We gather in faith of the power of diversity, the power of love, and the hope of a world transformed by our care. We gather in faith in ourselves and those around us, not a faith that requires perfection or rightness in one another, rather a faith that in our shared imperfections, we may learn to stumble and fall together. Faith that we will help one another to rise and to try again and again. We are Unitarian Universalists.
And as we've been doing the last couple of weeks, I will extend this chalice lighting. I'd like to take a moment to light some candles for some of the names of those who've been recently affected by police brutality. I acknowledge that we cannot cover all of the names of those who've been affected, but this is a gesture to hold those who've recently been affected and our commitment to racial justice. We light a candle for Breonna Taylor. We light a candle for Daniel Prude. We light a candle for the health of Jacob Blake. We do this because we are committed to continue to build a world that lives into racial justice, and because we want to proclaim for the world that Black lives do matter. And now I invite you to our first opening hymn. Let us hope the technological spirits are with us this morning as I invite you to sing our first hymn this morning, For the Earth Forever Turning, beautifully done by our choir. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed that hymn this morning, beautifully done by our choir. And now I invite Sarah to read our opening quote as we introduce our speaker and get ready for our sermon today.
I chose this quote because it reminds me that we have an important election ahead where we will use our votes to have a voice. One day I will be an ancestor, and I want my descendants to know I used my voice so they can have a future. And that quote is by Autumn Peltier. It's now time to introduce our speaker. As Emily said, that will be Bruce Knotts of the Unitarian Universalist United Nations office. I have a short bio for him I'd like to read. I've edited it some, and I apologize if it's a little bit out of date as to all the committees Bruce is on. Forgive me. I hope Bruce will forgive me if I indicate that he's the chair of something he's no longer the chair of. Here goes. Bruce Knotts was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia, worked for Raytheon in Saudi Arabia, and on a World Bank contract in Somalia before he joined the Department of State as a US diplomat in 1984. Bruce had diplomatic assignments in Greece, Zambia, India, Pakistan, Kenya, Gambia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Sudan. It's in Gambia where he served as the Deputy Chief of Mission. Bruce retired from the Foreign Service in 2007 and began directing the UNO office in 2008. Bruce founded faith-based advocacy for sexual orientation and gender identity, human rights at the UN and continues to advocate for the rights of women, Indigenous peoples, and for sustainable development in moral terms of faith and values. Bruce is now serving, or has served, as follows: as co-chair of the UN NGO Committee on Human Rights, the chair of the NGO Committee on Disarmament, Peace and Security, a member of the NGO UN Security Council Working Group, a member of the board of the NGO UN Committee on Sustainable Development, the chair of the NGO DPI Executive Committee at the UN, as a trustee of the Parliament of the World's Religions, and as a commissioner for the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation. In 2006, Bruce and Isaac Humphrey were married in Canada. Isaac works internationally as a venue manager, event environmentalist, photographer, and social media consultant.
Hello, I'm Bruce Knotts, Director of the Unitarian Universalist Association Office at the United Nations. We work in collaboration with the Canadian Unitarian Council. I'm delighted to be with. They say when all you get is lemons, make lemonade. As we can't be together in person, this is a great alternative. It also allows us to be in more places and connect with more of you without the cost and trouble of travel and accommodations. So this lemonade isn't so bad. Bob Woodward just came out with a new book on President Trump entitled Rage, where Trump made it clear to the author that he knew exactly how bad the pandemic would be, but he purposely minimized the danger so as not to panic the American people, he said. I love history. I have read and watched countless accounts of Winston Churchill. During his life and subsequently, much has been made of Churchill's faults and abilities. He had large measures of both, which makes him attractive to study. However, without a doubt, he alone gave Great Britain the leadership it needed to confront the Nazi fascist coalition, which conquered most of Europe, but not Great Britain. He led the British in their finest hour. Churchill took a very different road from Donald. Instead of hiding the gravity of the crisis, he told the British people that all he had to offer was blood, toil, tears, and sweat. The message called on the British people to sacrifice and work together to face a terrible foe that could only be defeated with unified resolve, sacrifice, and hard work of everyone in the country and beyond. We are at that moment again, and I'm not going to sugarcoat what's in front of us. We have known about climate change for over 50 years. We have done nothing, and even today our government is doing nothing as fires consume the West, as coastal communities are being inundated, and other areas face unprecedented droughts. Lyndon Johnson and Jimmy Carter warned us about climate change. Carter put solar panels on the roof of the White House, and Reagan removed them. Meanwhile, all this time, massive government subsidies continue to flow to fossil fuel companies, even as we speak today and for all the decades past. At this time, we cut funding to all scientific research and development. Alternative forms of energy research and development has also been starved of funding. In December 1997, 150 countries met and adopted the Kyoto Protocols to reduce carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. The U.S. refused to join. When I was the regional refugee coordinator for the U.S. government in West Africa, Republican Representative Jim Sensenbrenner, who was at the time the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, visited and wanted to see refugee camps in the region. I was his guide. Everyone in the U.S. Embassy at Abidjan was laughing at the prospect of the progressive Bruce Knotts spending 2 weeks in refugee camps with the very conservative Jim Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin. We visited refugee camps crowded with 40,000 or more African refugees. Sensenbrenner asked in a panic, how are we going to keep these people from coming to the United States? My response was easy. Take care of them where they are with decent housing, schools, jobs, and necessities for a dignified life. As we bounced around African back roads to get to the camps, Jim Sensenbrenner regaled me with his stories of how he single-handedly kept the United States out of the Kyoto Protocols. He told me repeatedly how unfair the Kyoto Protocols were to the United States. This is the crux of my message today. The matter of fairness continues to arise when it comes to climate change. It is the major sticking point to progress. The genius of the Paris Climate Accords was that each nation came with their own best plan to combat climate change and then signed the agreement obligating their nation to fulfill the commitments they themselves had devised for their own country. And still we are failing. Trump continues to subsidize oil companies and to starve all other scientific research and development, including that for sustainable forms of energy. And he has withdrawn the USA from the Paris Climate Accords. India was also very vocal in Paris, saying that it was unfair for the West to have created vast wealth and infrastructure using fossil fuels only to ask developing countries such as India to reduce use of fossil fuels. Again, the issue of fairness and equity raised its head. If the agreement was unfair to India, then the world must continue to suffer climate change. New Delhi is the most polluted city in the world, impairing the health of millions of its citizens. It also compromises India's ability to combat COVID-19. India has the second highest death rate, overtaking Brazil and second only to the United States in deaths per million from the pandemic. A colleague of mine had a medical exam in India, and the doctor told her to quit smoking. She responded that she didn't smoke. The doctor said, then what is that stuff in your lungs? And she responded, that's India in my lungs. We all suffer from climate change. The only fair answer is for us all to work together to face this crisis. Fact: human beings are migratory, just as are Canadian geese, elephants, whales, and many other species on this planet. People will move if living conditions are intolerable where they are. So, what are the courses before us? We've waited too long to combat climate change. The clock has run out. All we can do now is try to adapt and mitigate. One thing people will do is migrate. Walls and violence will slow the migration, and thousands will die. Perhaps millions or billions of people will die in the process, but the migration will continue. For the past more than 50 years, the world community has done next to nothing, mostly on the pretext that any deal will appear unfair to one nation or another. If human beings are by nature migratory, we are also by nature adverse to global cooperation. We have managed all these thousands of years to exist being tribes, races, nations, religions, and divided in every way imaginable. Today, we are divided between those who will wear a mask to protect themselves and others, and those who insist that it is their constitutional right not to wear a mask. FYI, I have read the U.S. Constitution from beginning to end, and there is no such right not to wear a mask to protect yourself and others. Nonetheless, we have a mask-wearing tribe, and we have a I don't care about your health or mine, and I won't wear a mask tribe. While no group of people can agree on anything for long, we all seem destined to divide one way or another. However, there is an ancient and vast segment of humanity that, while divided amongst themselves, are united in their relation to the planet. Indigenous peoples are divided into groups and tribes, but united in their respect for the planet and the planet's systems. Wherever they live in harmony with nature and environment. They are the best teachers and guides to living gently on the earth. Some Eastern religions also point the way to a more sustainable forms of living and eating. The United Nations has told us that it is vital for us to have vastly increased areas on the Earth's surface covered with natural forests. Forests are the lungs of the Earth. They clean the air of pollutants. Unfortunately, we are burning forests and giving more land over to cattle raising. The United Nations said that we must change what we eat. We must adopt a more plant-based diet if we are to survive. We Unitarian Universalists have a workable answer. It is the 2011 Sustainable Statement of Conscience on Ethical Eating, Food and Environmental Justice. It begins, quote, "Aware of our interdependence, we acknowledge that eating ethically requires us to be mindful of the miracle of life we share with all beings. With gratitude for the food we have received, we strive to choose foods that minimize harm and are protective of the environment, consumers, farmers, and all those involved in food production and distribution," unquote. I encourage you to read the entire document, but I'll quote a few more lines. Access to adequate supply of healthy food and clean water is a basic human need and right. Many people do not have adequate food, while others have a surplus. Minimally processed plant-based diets are healthier diets. We encourage a knowledgeable food choice based on understanding the demands of feeding a growing world population, unquote. The following year, 2012, the UUA General Assembly passed a responsive resolution. Quote, "We, the delegates of the 2012 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association, repudiate the doctrine of discovery as a relic of colonialism, feudalism, and religious, cultural, and racial biases having no place in the modern treatment of Indigenous peoples, and we call on the United States to fully implement the standards of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in U.S. law and policy without qualifications," unquote. I encourage you to read the entire UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples adopted in 2007. Here are but a few provisions. Quote, "Affirming that Indigenous peoples are equal to all others and recognizing the rights of all peoples to be different, to consider themselves different, to be respected as such. Affirming that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures which constitute the common heritage of humankind. Affirming further that all doctrines, policies, and practices based on or advocating superiority of peoples or individuals on the basis of national origin or racial, religious, ethnic, or cultural differences are racist, scientifically false, legally invalid, morally condemnable, and socially unjust." Article 7. Indigenous individuals have the rights to life, physical and mental integrity, liberty, and security of person. 2. Indigenous peoples have a collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples and shall not be subjected to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children from the group to another group. Article 10. Indigenous people shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without the free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation where possible, with an option to return, unquote. UN DRIP, as the UN Declaration is called, has 46 articles, of which I've read only 2. There is much to learn and absorb. I hope you take the time to do so. How should we think of Indigenous peoples? Most progressive people see Indigenous people as among those on the planet who have been abused and wrongfully treated, and much more. All of this is true. However, I ask you to think of Indigenous peoples in a different way. Think of them as the teachers that we desperately need in this frightening time of climate change. Indigenous peoples hunt for food and supplies, grow crops, gather food, and other materials needed for life from nature. However, unlike the rest of us, they don't have a history of totally depleting resources. They gather what's needed while preserving resources for the future. The great buffalo herds of the American West provided most of what Indigenous peoples needed, and these herds were never in danger of extinction. It was the U.S. government that ordered the extinction of the buffalo in order to starve Indigenous people to death so white people could steal Indigenous land more easily. All modern civilizations, East and West, have lost their ability to live sustainably on the planet. When once meat was eaten for special occasions like Thanksgiving, weddings, Chinese New Year's, now all over the world, everyone seems to feel entitled to eat large quantities of beef and other meats 3 or more times every day, to the point that we're killing the planet with our eating habits. In 2020, the Unitarian Universalist Association office at the United Nations, working in collaboration with the Canadian Unitarian Council, hosted our spring seminar on the topic of climate justice virtually, with a focus on Indigenous peoples. In 2021, we will host a seminar again on the topic of climate justice with a focus on food equity. While the virtual seminar deprives us of in-person contact, it gives us the ability to reach participants and invite speakers from around the world without the cost of travel to New York City. We are able this year and will be able next year to obtain live speakers from around the world, including amazing youth speakers such as the speakers we had this year from the Philippines, Scotland, Canada, and elsewhere. With more experience and more time to prepare in 2021, our seminar will be even better. We continue to engage the United Nations in virtual meetings with the permanent representatives of all of the members of the UN Security Council, with high-level UN diplomats for other member states, and with NGO leaders and from both faith-based and secular organizations. While we work virtually, our work is not free. We continue to need your support to be able to promote our values at the United Nations, and importantly, to learn and transmit back to you the experience and wisdom of the entire world that meets and works at the United Nations to ensure that we have a sustainable, peaceful, and just world for ourselves and those who come after us. Please support this important and vital work. Thank you.
We are so grateful for Bruce Knotts and all of those words of wisdom we heard this morning, the great work of our United Nations office as part of our denomination. Climate justice really is such an important and vital part, as I know we've had many services talking about it. And so I would like to share with you ways and help support our United Nations office. I'm going to put in the chat for everyone links for how to give. You should see them posted in our chat. And I'll go ahead and share this beautifully and lovingly created offer segment for all of you.
At a time when nationalism is so dominant around the world, having a Unitarian Universalist voice represented at the United Nations is more critical than ever. The Unitarian Universalist Association office at the United Nations has held a prominent place at the UN since 1962, advocating for UU values on the global stage. By engaging every day with member states and agencies and speaking out in defense of human rights for those who are oppressed, the UU office has become a force to be reckoned with at the UN. The UU at UN's advocacy and coalition building helped to make sexual orientation and gender identity human rights a priority throughout the UN system. And we continue to be a leader on sexual orientation and gender identity issues within the UN human rights community. This year, our office is focused on bringing the global community together to share solutions for demilitarizing local police forces and to amplify just and inclusive ways to keep communities safe. Through our affiliation with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UU office at the UN gets credentials for observers to represent Unitarian Universalists and participate in the annual UN climate conferences. In recent years, we have prioritized getting passes for Indigenous and frontline climate activists who are so often excluded from these intergovernmental conferences. We know that the international community must come together to solve global problems like climate change, but that governments aren't necessarily the ones who have the right solutions. Solutions need to come from communities that are most impacted by the changing climate. And the UUA office at the UN is proud to help representatives of these communities get to international gatherings so that their perspectives can be heard at the decision-making tables. None of this work would be possible without the generous support of Unitarian Universalists. Right now, those who represent the United States at the UN are working hard to destroy protections for human rights, for the environment, and for global cooperation. Make sure that you still have someone at the UN who's committed to upholding your values and interests. The UU office at the UN relies on congregational and individual donations to continue its work advocating for a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Please donate generously now to help our office maintain this important presence at the UN. If at least 5% of this congregation's members donate at a supporter level of $60 or more, you are on your way to achieving the 6th Principal Congregation Award. You can donate through text or online. To give by mobile phone, simply text UN Sunday to 51555. To give online, go to giving.uua.org/UU@UN. Thank you so much for your generosity. Your gifts can truly have a global impact.
And thank you to everyone at our UUUNO office who does so much to advocate for our values at the United Nations. I will now share another song as a hymn. Or wait a second, no, actually, I will invite Sarah to read a meditation and prayer this morning.
A prayer of healing. We join with the earth and with each other to bring new life to the land, to restore the waters, to refresh the air. We join with the earth and with each other to renew the forests, to care for the plants, to protect the creatures. We join with the earth and with each other to celebrate the seas, to rejoice the sunlight, to sing the song of the stars. We join with the earth and with each other to recall our destiny, to renew our spirits, to reinvigorate our bodies. We join with the earth and with each other to create the human community, to promote justice and peace, to remember our children. We join together as many and diverse expressions of one loving mystery for the healing of the earth and the renewal of all life.
Blessed be, and amen. And now, let us sing. This will fold right beautifully into our prayer for healing, as it is a meditation on healing and breathing. This song is the hymn Meditation on Breathing. Please feel free to sing along. Just stay muted from home, and you can sing along with our beautiful choir. What a joy it is to have our choir with us this morning. I now invite Sarah to extinguish our chalice this morning.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. For these we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Close our service with words from Kimberly Quinn Johnson. fitted for this day. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are not perfect, but we are perfectly fitted for this day. We are not without fault, but we can be honest to face our past as we chart a new future. We are the ones we have been waiting for. May we be bold and courageous to chart that new future. May we have faith in a future that is not known. We are the ones we have been waiting for.